So for my remarks today, I would like to highlight the arrest of Khurram Parvez, an internationally renowned human rights defender who has been in judicial custody since November 2021 under the recently amended Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, UAPA, an anti-terror law that gives the Indian government broad discretionary powers to designate individuals as terrorists and criminalize activities that are crucial for upholding people's freedoms, civil rights, and liberties. The UAPA Act, as many analysts have argued, violates international covenant on civil and political rights by reneging on the principle of innocent until proven guilty, and it bypasses fundamental legal procedures that include protection from warrantless search, provision of bail or anticipatory bail, and the right to timely and just trials. Over the past 2 decades and more, Khurram Parvez has worked as the program coordinator and spokesperson for JKCCS, Jammu Kashmir Coalition of Civil Society, a Kashmir-based human rights organization. JKCCS has used extensive research and reportage to document the vast array of India's repressive laws and mechanisms designed to silence Kashmiri voices, the UAPA being the most recent iteration of these draconian laws, as many of the panelists have already pointed out. I highlight Khurram's case here because his recent arrest under UAPA is not an attack or punitive action against one individual, but a systemic, concerted, and purposeful act of erasure and delegitimization of civil society mobilizations that demand Kashmiri people's fundamental right to determine their political futures. India's National Security Advisor, Ajit Doval, in his November 2021 statement declared that civil society in India was now the new frontier of war. Instead of fighting on territorial frontiers, the Indian government, he declared, was committed to saving India from its civil society, a project that was initiated by the Congress government years before Narendra Modi came to power. The Congress government's 2010 amendments to the Foreign Contribution Regulatory Act limited international funds for civil society efforts under the pretext of restraining foreign influence on domestic politics, a policy that undermined key social, environmental, and rights-based movements across India and in Kashmir. This trend has assumed alarming proportions under Narendra Modi, whose government has routinely blamed international NGOs such as Greenpeace, Amnesty, and ActionAid for hurting India's democracy as well as its economic well-being. According to media reports, by 2018, Modi had canceled the licenses of nearly 20,000 NGOs receiving international funding. By criminalizing civil society actions and their mandate, India has undermined any credible space committed to principles of social and political justice. NIA raids on offices and homes of journalists, human rights activists, academics, students, and lawyers in Kashmir are carried out under the pretext of investigating terror funding circuits, a smokescreen that India has used to shield itself from international outrage against the systematic denial of fundamental human rights and dignity to Kashmiris. And yet, as we've heard now from other panelists, the repression of their individual and collective voices, of Kashmiri individual and collective voices, and the clamping down of their public and political expression, as well as the silencing of their demands for rights and accountability, have a much longer history that precedes the recent onslaught on their lives and on their dignities. In Kashmir, the UAPA's implications, for instance, are compounded by a range of pre-existing legal, political, military, and juridical instruments that include AFSPA, the AFPSA law that was imposed in the 1990s and affords absolute impunity to the Indian military against a range of violent acts against civilian populations, such as enforced disappearances, custodial tortures, deaths, sexual violence, etc. And the Jammu and Kashmir Public Safety Act, PSA 1978, which legalizes preventive detention and has led since its inception in the 1970s to the arbitrary arrests and detention of hundreds of Kashmiris. In a pre-existing culture of institutionalized impunity and violence that has existed for decades in the region, the UAPA has led to the further weaponization of law against Kashmiri civil society. Since 2019, 2,300 Kashmiris have been booked under the UAPA. These include the widely publicized cases of Kashmiri journalists, Asif Sultan, who's been in jail for over 3 years, Fahad Shah and Sajjad Gul. All three of them have been arrested and rearrested multiple times to keep them out of public circulation and to crush journalism and free expression in Kashmir. There are thousands of other cases in which young Kashmiri men have been arrested under multiple pretexts, from cheering for the Pakistani cricket team, to sheltering militants, to resorting to various everyday activities that are seen to now, quote unquote, glamorize militancy. A PhD scholar accused of promoting sedition was recently booked under UAPA for his 2011 article in an online forum. In recent months, charges of sedition have been used to fire several Kashmiri academics from the university jobs, and India's appointed Lieutenant General, an unelected head of the state, is controlling prominent recruitments to leadership positions in local universities. Apart from the legal and military infrastructure and punitive laws, such as the PSA and UAPA, Kashmiris experienced a series of uninterrupted lockdowns beginning in August 2019 after the abrogation of 370 and 35A. As Kashmiris remained caged inside their homes for months on end, and Kashmir was turned into an open prison, the Indian media and policy circuits worked overtime to package India's settler colonial interventions in Kashmir as economic development, as we just heard. During this phase of military siege, Kashmiris had no access to media, phone services, or the internet, a phenomenon that Kashmiri rights group called a digital apartheid. In a 2020 report published by Access Now, a nonprofit digital rights group that documented how internet shutdowns had become a systematic tool to repress democratic expression the world over, India had shut down the internet the most, 109 times over the course of 2020. The internet shutdowns in Kashmir, that report claimed, accounted for almost 90% of all internet shutdowns in India that year. Within this context, thus, to assert and to uphold fundamental rights, to claim that Kashmiri lives matter, and to work consistently to demand justice and accountability is no easy task. It is precisely why Khurram Parvez's extensive body of work is so vital. It ensures that through fact-based reportage and documentation, international justice communities are able to access the historic and unfolding truth of India's brutal violations of Kashmiri rights and the ongoing and relentless assault on their dignities. His arrest has made it impossible for JKCCS to do the important everyday work of engaging with victims of human rights violations and for opening up pathways of justice and reparations for them amidst already very difficult circumstances. Human rights defenders are not terrorists, as Mary Lalore reminds us. And human rights work of the kind JKCCS has done plays a crucial role in maintaining structures of redressal, dialogue, justice, and accountability. For the past 30 years or so, JKCCS has produced research-based reports that are a rich compendium of highly credible data and information that have informed UN reports, scholarly papers, and advocacy efforts globally. Their body of work stands out for its commitment to the principles of grounded field-based research, diligent fact-checking, and rigorous documentation. Their many reports include, for instance, a 2012 report on alleged perpetrators, which foregrounds acts of state violence within the wider context of legal and structural impunity. In their 2009 report entitled Buried Evidence on Unknown and Unmarked Mass Graves in Kashmir, they document 2,700 unknown, unmarked, and mass graves containing 2,943 plus bodies across 55 villages in Bandipora, Baramulla, and Kupwara districts of Kashmir. And the 2015 report, Structures of Violence, builds on earlier reports to illustrate how structures of impunity and particular forms and tactics of violence are both inflicted and sustained through institutional mechanisms. One of their first reports, which was based on their independent analysis of the 2004 elections in Kashmir, foregrounded Quote, the procedural performance of democracy in Kashmir. The key argument of the report was how a formal procedure of election intrinsic to democracy cannot be imposed on a real and existing undemocratic structure, essentially cannot be imposed on an occupation. In cases such as these, the symbolic performance of democracy can become a foil to cover up state-directed violence. This early work also brought to fore the cost of working to document human rights violations in Kashmir. During their work as independent observers in 2004, a mine blast killed 2 of their colleagues while Khurram was injured and lost his leg. In 2018, Mr. Imroz, the co-founder of JKCCS, was attacked by armed men at his home in Srinagar. Their highly credible research informed the 2018 and 2019 UNHCR reports and innumerable other global human rights reports and parliamentary deliberations in the US and the EU. Juani Mendes, in his prologue, writes, and I quote, although it marks, in one of the reports, the prologue remarks, although it makes for painful reading, the report is an outstanding example of how human rights organizations should monitor, investigate, and report on violations of internationally recognized standards by governments toward all persons under their jurisdiction. And this is just to remind you that several years ago, the Supreme Court of India had dismissed a petition which was filed by non-government organizations reportedly seeking investigations into the killing of Kashmiri Pandits. The Supreme Court order was based on they denied conducting the investigation, and it was based on the reason that 27 years had passed since the crimes in question had happened, and therefore there was no fruitful reason to conduct this investigation. And JKCCS, Khurram in particular, stood out and basically asked for all crimes of state to be investigated, or crimes across different organizations be investigated in Kashmir. And that's the kind of work that Khurram and the CCS represent in Kashmir. So the frontline defenders of CCS are not only archivists, but they're also translators who make it possible for international frameworks of legal and political rights to resonate for Kashmir's political context, but also push international institutions to account for abuses of state power in Kashmir and in the global South more broadly. Their sustained collaborative and deliberative partnerships among transnational networks of lawyers, scholars, and activists have played a key role in situating Kashmiri rights and aspirations within larger paradigms of international law. Through this work, they reiterate and remind the international community that the Kashmir issue must be resolved according to UN resolutions that guarantee Kashmiris the right to determine their political future. As a researcher, I've seen Khurram and CCS more broadly facilitate and enable grounded and field-based research. Khurram's care and commitment toward young interns, many of who talk about the ways they saw in him a ray of hope, his vision and hopefulness for Kashmir's future, and the labor he and his organization are invested in to work towards a just future for all Kashmiris is truly exemplary. The silencing of voices like Khurram's or that of Asif Sultan's or countless other activists, scholars, and journalists in Kashmir makes the global project of democracy, freedom, rights, and justice extremely fragile. While Kashmir's resolution according to the principles of self-determination is critical for substantive peace in the subcontinent, it is also key to ensuring that fascism does not trump the global movement for freedom, liberty, and inclusive justice. Thank you.